This episode of Primitive Culture is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and to help Trek FM at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm.
And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the non-profit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the USS Enterprise orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org.
And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
This is Tim Russ, Lieutenant Commander Tuvok on Star Trek Voyager, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Open your mind to the past. Oh, this may mean something.
I've been coerced into watching tonight's movie.
You do have books in the 24th century.
It's a primitive culture. I'm just trying to blend in.
Some people think the future means the end of history. We haven't run out of history quite yet.
Hello and welcome to Primitive Culture, a Trek FM podcast all about our history, our culture and how Star Trek relates to it. I'm Duncan Barrett and today I'm joined by two very special guests. We've got, first of all, Tony Robinson, host of Continuing Mission and an frequent contributor to Primitive Culture.
And producer of Melodic Treks.
Of course. How could I forget? And then that may come into some of our discussion later on today, I think,
Indeed.
because the topic that we're talking about today, the music, is definitely a very significant element of it. And I'm also joined by Chris Nunn, lecturer in film at the University of Greenwich, who has graced this podcast before as well, when we talked about First Contact about 6 months ago?
I
something
think
like
so,
that. Yeah. And we're back. We're back at the University of Greenwich. We're sitting in the cinema in the university. And the reason is this episode is actually picking up on a conversation that Tony and I had a long time ago when we recorded our episode about the Wrath of Khan. I don't know if you even remember this, Tony, but we went to see a screening at the Prince Charles Cinema.
We did.
And while we were recording in the bar, they were screening 2001, A Space Odyssey. And I said to Tony, it's funny, I've never seen 2001. And Tony said, I can't believe it. That's my favourite film. I love that film. How can you not have seen it? And anyway, this sparked an idea in my head. We should watch 2001. So I mentioned this to Chris. Chris said, I can screen it for you. I screen it for my students every year. So here we are to watch 2001, A Space Odyssey. And because this is Primitive Culture, we're going to be looking at it in terms of its influence on Star Trek, in particular of its influence on the motion picture, which I think picked up an awful lot from that film. And we're kind of going to borrow the format of another podcast, which some of our listeners will probably be familiar with, the Missing Frames podcast over on the Nerd Party Network. And basically the format of that podcast is that they take a film that, as they put it, everyone should have seen by this point in their lives. One of the people on the podcast hasn't seen it, so that'll be me today. The others have seen it and have their own views about it. It's something that's important to them, something they've got a lot to say about. And then so we chat for a little bit beforehand, and then we watch the film, and then we chat again, and we see whether my expectations were met, whether what it was like for me as a kind of newbie coming into this film, whether it surprised me, whether it kind of fit what I was expecting or not. But maybe just before we go into the film, the two of you could talk to me a little bit about 2001. Try not to spoil it for me. I probably, I've been familiar with the kind of pop culture around this film, so I probably have absorbed quite a few lines of it without having seen it. But without spoiling too much of the plot, what is it, Tony, why don't you start? What is it about this film that is so important to you that has made such an impact on you?
Right. Well, to start with, when I saw this film for the first time, I was just 12 years of age.
Wow.
And it didn't make any sense. And it didn't make any sense because we'd grown up in an era of film where stories were linear. Mm-hmm. It had a start, a middle, and an end. And in a certain sense, this movie has a start, a middle, and an end. You just don't realize it, or you're not, because of the way it's cut, because of the way it's shot. You don't engage with it immediately. So a lot of people ended up confused. I ended up confused, particularly the ending, which everybody is confused at.
Oh, that's something for me to look forward to then.
So over the years, it was my mission, which I chose to accept, to find out more about this movie, mm-hmm. what it meant, why it was made, and what it was saying to the audience. a comment from Arthur C. Clarke, who co-wrote the movie, because it wasn't an original story. It was a combination of ideas, but based on a story that Arthur C. Clarke had written called The Sentinel, at the core of 2001 in a sense. But Arthur C. Clarke said that MGM had just spent $10 million on the most religious movie ever made, which he was alluding to was the story of creation, or at least the story of man's intelligence coming out of an evolutionary period from when the apes and chimpanzees were roaming the earth, and suddenly one group dominated the other and then subsequently grew in or evolved into humans. That's what Arthur C. Clarke said. So he had that comment to make. What was your question?
Why is this film so important to you? I'm kind of curious. So you saw it. You saw it age 12, and maybe you didn't quite get it, but it intrigued you. Because I was going to say, actually, I say I've never seen this film before. I did try to watch this film once when I was a kid. I was probably, I don't know, like about 8 years old. I don't think I got past the monkeys jumping around at the beginning. Right, okay. I was just like, this is supposed to be a science fiction film. Yeah. You know, what on earth is this? And I switched off the TV. And I think that's one reason I've never gone and watched it, is because I had this initial experience where I was just like totally, I don't know, taken aback and disappointed really by this film. And obviously in subsequent years, I've heard so much about it. I've heard so many people say how important it is to them, what a masterpiece it is. You know, Chris, you've told me you show it for your students every year. It's kind of a real cornerstone of understanding film and so on. And yet for some reason, I think I've always felt a bit daunted by it, having had that initial bad experience. But I'm kind of curious, Tony, you obviously watched it at quite a young age, and yet you didn't have that experience. It sucked you in. Its mysteries kind of appealed to you.
You will have a bad experience watching this movie because of the way it's cut. It's you know, there's images juxtaposed with other images, and they don't seem to gel, and they don't seem to tell a story. You have to understand the arc of the story, and there's a theme going through it that isn't blatantly obvious, but if we talk about it later, maybe we can highlight some things. So I think, to answer your original question, which I should have answered right from the beginning, was why is this film so important? Well, the real answer is I don't know. It's because from that age, it was sending out a subliminal message to me, and I was picking up on it, but I didn't know why I was picking up on it. I was in awe of the cinematography. I was in awe of the scenes in space. I was in awe of the things that went on inside the main ship Discovery. I was in awe of everything, and I was drawn to it. But in terms of what message it was giving off, I was too young to understand. And so later on in life, I now can comment in a much better way about this movie and add some of my own thoughts.
You were Spock going through the Kolinar ceremony and being drawn by this mysterious phenomenon that you didn't quite understand, but you couldn't get it out of your head. You were kind of sucked in to study it and strap on that jetpack and go into the depths of this movie.
I'm not just Spock going through Kolinar. I'm Spock going through Vija.
Right, right. And you're still on that journey by the sounds of it.
Oh, yeah.
This is something that...
Well, Vija's very big.
Yeah. Absolutely. You could get lost in there. Well, Chris, what about you? I mean, this is a film that you showed to students. This is something that obviously you think is something that they should see if like me, they haven't seen it yet. What is it that you are thinking of when you're showing it to them? What is it that you want them to take away from this film?
It's a very difficult watch for the modern film student.
Okay.
And so part of me starts there by thinking, exactly as Tony has said, this narrative is not conventional. The film is asking you, the audience and the viewer, to do a bit of work in order to piece some of these things together. That's not quite, that's a bit alien to a modern film student. That's why I show it, because I think if you're going to be a filmmaker, you should understand that there isn't actually just one way of telling a story or of running a narrative. But also, I think it's an absolute landmark, a huge cinematic landmark. Obviously, Kubrick has an incredible career, and lots of his films are really interesting for a variety of reasons. But my personal feeling as a huge science fiction fan is that this film is a bit of a landmark for lots of stuff that came in the next decade. And obviously we've got films like Star Wars and Alien that kind of rejuvenated the box office and cinema going in the late 70s. And this film, I think those films borrow a lot in many ways from this, but it took 10 years almost for that to kind of seep through. And again, that's why I think it's really important for students to understand that maybe some change takes time. Maybe there are some evolutionary steps in cinema that you won't make that link, but it might be worth exploring and seeing something you haven't seen.
And it's interesting from a Star Trek point of view. This film came out in 1968, I think. So actually, during the kind of period of the original series, and in a way, without having seen it, just from what I have seen of it, and also having just watched the motion picture, which I would talk a bit about later about how that film borrows from 2001. But I guess in terms of my anticipation, my expectations, I'm expecting some of the same kind of pacing, maybe some of the same kind of approach to space. And just from the clips I've seen from 2001 and so on, very, very different from the original series, with the kind of bright, brash, colourful, quite sort of pasty, quite sort of very emotional kind of sci-fi, if you know what I mean. This to me, maybe we'll talk again in a couple of hours and we'll see whether I've changed my mind, but I'm expecting something a bit more cool, a bit more detached, partly because of the kind of expectations that go with Kubrick as this kind of, how do you put it, like a sort of a very detailed genius, but a bit sort of having that slightly aloof quality potentially. But it's interesting to me thinking about it in terms of this film as being something that comes out of absolutely the era of Star Trek and that era of science fiction, but obviously, of course, then has a legacy going forward. I mean, the motion picture came out about 10 years after this film. So in terms of the influence that we're looking at, there's quite a long period of that kind of influencing the culture and influencing that filmmaking process. But anyway, so we talked a little bit about my expectations of this film. It sounds like from what you two are saying, this is going to be a bit of a slog, so maybe we'd better get straight into it.
Yeah,
you're going to qualify that, Tony.
I think if you're seeing it for the first time, it might come across as a slog, but when you get into the main action, it actually moves along quite rapidly. But I don't think it's a spoiler to say that there's no dialogue for 20 minutes.
Okay, so
unless you include a series of grunts, screeches, and yipping.
This is what kind of killed it for me the first time round. Definitely.
My personal favourite is the yipping.
Right. Okay. I'll look out for that. I'll think of you when we get to that bit. I suppose it's one of those films, because it's such a classic. It is kind of like Citizen Kane. It is like one of those kind of really big revered movies. There's a real pressure for me because I'm like, okay, I've got to like this film. Chris was saying to me earlier, if you like science fiction, you ought to like this film. If I hate this film, does that make me a bad person?
No.
I don't think you'll hate it. I think you'll be in awe of it.
Okay.
I don't expect you, and I don't think Chris expects you to make sense of it. From the middle part, you can just about get a storyline going because it does tell a story. It's a mystery. Why is this person behaving that way? Why did that happen? How did it come about that this thing happened? And so you're wondering and trying to figure that out. Is there malice intended? Is it, there's all sorts of things going on. And then towards the end, it switches to it tells a different tale. But if we get into it now, by the time we come back to it to talk about it again, we can add some ideas in. But there's lots of, and Chris will have fantastic points. I think maybe Chris will have fantastic points from a filmmaker's point of view, and I might have some points from a storyteller's point of view, and I might have some insights into certain things that happen subliminally, as I said earlier, throughout the movie, and then I'll highlight those later, but you'll have to remind me because...
Well, let's hope so. And I'll just be in a kind of catatonic state from pure overwhelmed. Right. I'll be again like Spock, lying on the bio bed, tears streaming down my face, and kind of bamboozled by the whole experience.
Yeah. Well, can I just say one thing as we go into the movie? I'm just going to get into my little pod and go into hypersleep. So you're going to wake me up 18 months later.
Okay. Well, maybe it will feel like 18 months. We'll see. But I think that's as good a time as any to hit play. So without any further ado, Mr. Nunn on screen. Well, that was quite an experience. I have to say, that was more of a strange art house experimental kind of experience than I was anticipating. I think I had it in my head that once we got past the apes and up into space, it would be a slightly more conventional film, and it was definitely unconventional in many ways. I see what you meant, Tony, about there being a chunk in the middle where it was had a bit more of a kind of comprehensible, or at least less mysterious plot. But I mean, what a fantastic experience. Thank you, Chris, for screening that for me. And thanks, Tony, for coming along. Yeah, no, I found that very interesting. I think it might take me a while to digest it. I'll go home and have a little think about that.
Yeah.
But
take a while or several watches.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you two? What since we're here partly to talk about this film in relation to the motion picture, what kind of things did you notice on this viewing? Maybe thinking about it in terms of with that in mind, what jumps out at you seeing it today for the 14th, 15th, millionth time, whatever it is for you guys?
The pacing is often what people link with the motion picture and 2001. I think that is correct, but there's something quite specific going on, I think, which is that in 2001, it's quite methodical in the way it lays out how it's all working, how we're actually in space. You know, that whole sequence. So from the bone goes up, you've got the ship and the station, the people walking around with gravity boots. There's a certain, he's got a level of detail towards the technology and the practicalities of being in space. And in the motion picture, there's a lot of attention paid to the starship, to approaching the starship. That certainly in that introductory sequence, the overly long drive to the Enterprise, when I thought they were supposed to be in a bit of a hurry. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I thought Kirk just said this was urgent, and yet somehow, but there's people in spacesuits wandering around, outside the Enterprise. They were quite careful about the scale, and there's a level of detail there that I again, on rewatching this, think is very similar to what Kubrick's doing here.
Definitely that sense of scale. And both films, of course, have people, very small human figures in spacesuits contrasted with these enormous spaceships and so on. It struck me, certainly, watching the motion picture again last night, that, first of all, there's this weird combination there of the supposed urgency of the mission with the fact I timed it was like 37 minutes, I think, before the Enterprise leaves space dock on this, massively urgent mission. They don't get to Vija for about an hour or so into the film. But there's also one of the things that struck me about it that makes it feel, because I think one of the issues that some people have with the motion picture is it feels quite un-Star Trek. It may be coming off of TOS and going into it. It was very different in a lot of ways, and partly that was because it had picked things up, from the cinema, and particularly probably from this film, and from other films as well. It felt very different. But it's also quite unlike the Star Trek that comes after it, because then, of course, there's a massive course correction in a way with the Wrath of Khan and in a way, the kind of original series movies, I guess, they vary quite a lot. I mean, they go in a lot of very strange directions. If you think of like The Voyage Home and so on, they're quite experimental in their own way in terms of playing with genre and playing with the kind of what we might think a Star Trek movie might be. Certainly compared to, say, the more recent, the Kelvin movies, which are all quite... they're different, and some of them are maybe more successful than others, but they're kind of on a formula, and the formula is fairly predictable, and broadly speaking, what you're going to get. But the other thing that struck me, that definitely reminded me of, or seemed like a kind of link between these two films, as well as the kind of that sense of scale of the space things, is this emphasis on, as you say, Chris, the kind of practicalities of it and almost the kind of nuts and bolts of it. And in the motion picture, one of the things I thought was weird is we have endless docking scenes. We have all these ships docking with each other, and you think, hang on, isn't Star Trek meant to be all about the transporter? And the transporter is, it was about saving money, but it's also about getting it's quick action. It's basically you go from one place to another. You don't have to bother with all that kind of sci-fi paraphernalia in a way. And yet, weirdly, in the motion picture, somehow they brought all of that stuff that Star Trek deliberately eschewed on TV. They kind of brought all of that in. But then, of course, the motion picture is the Star Trek story that has a horrific transporter accident right at the beginning. And it's very strange. Like, you've got this awful transporter accident. These people are completely, mutilated and deformed or whatever. If you read the novel by Gene Roddenberry, he talks about how they came out inside out or whatever. It's this really gruesome thing. Then you've got the next mention of the transporter is McCoy basically saying, I'm not getting in that thing. but he does anyway. So I don't know. It's this weird. I sort of wonder whether that is almost a kind of emblem of what's going on in the motion picture. This refusal to, the transporter being the technology more so than warp drive, more than anything really that is associated with Star Trek. It's kind of, beam me up. That's what we think of as Star Trek. And suddenly that's kind of massively problematic. And as a result, we get all this kind of, this much a slowed down approach to space travel.
Yeah, actually, Spock arriving is a bit of a curious one, isn't it? Because that's a ship that then detaches from a ship in order to dock. And you think, but you could have just beamed him over.
Yeah,
I don't understand.
They didn't have side-to-side beaming.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
Well, and that Vulcan ship didn't have a transporter system installed.
Or
maybe it was a spirit ship. It was like the Kolinar monks,
it's much
ship.
More,
much more.
It's more something than that. No, Enterprise uses Windows 10 and Vulcans were on Apple.
Right,
They don't talk to each other.
No, fair enough. Well, if anyone's going to be using an outdated and difficult and kind of, problematic transporter system, it's probably the Vulcans. They're going to say that they can't transport to and from anyone else's ships. But you're right, absolutely. That sense of one thing detaches from this thing and another thing attaches to this and detaches from this and so. And definitely in 2001, I was getting that feeling, not knowing. I mean, I knew at some point they were going to get somewhere where the monolith was or where something was going to happen. But there seemed to be a lot of stages. First we've got to get to the station, then you've got to get from the station to the moon, then you've got to get from the
moon out to where the monolith is. How long,
kind of
in 2001, how long does it take to land a bloody ship?
Yeah.
I mean, they're lining it up like it's some kind of Atari computer game, obviously well ahead of its time.
In essence it was, and the wonderful game Elite was based on that, because you had to line yourself up with the slot in whatever planet or space station you were going to, and then you had to rotate at the same speed so that you could do it. So they based that. That was a wonder. I loved playing that game. That was amazing.
Well, which is what we see real life NASA astronauts doing these kind of things, and I suppose it is definitely the sense of realism in terms of the kind of practicality and the kind of pragmatics of space travel and all that kind of. It's very. I mean, I think this film very much avoids the sort of science fiction. A lot of science fiction, there's a bit of fudging going on. Do you know what I mean? Whether it's like, how does the warp drive work? Whether it's like, how does the gravity work? All these kind of things that we sort of accept. The things that you suspend your disbelief about when you watch a science fiction film, usually. Whereas this one, it feels very much like it's kind of, yes, like you say, very rigorous about kind of explaining all of that, even down to the Velcro shoes or whatever they are. At the same time as marrying that with this very kind of expressionistic, kind of experimental visual approach, this kind of, not totally straightforward approach to what's good. Particularly towards the end, you're kind of thinking, well, I was certainly thinking, I'm not 100% sure what is actually going on here. What am I seeing? Who is experiencing what's even the perspective within this scene? Because it's,
at the end of the
so
day,
kind of
you have to
dreamlike
remember,
and so mysterious.
At the end of the day, you've got to remember it is telling a story. There is a point to the movie, or at least Stanley Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke are making a point. They got $10 million from MGM to go make your movie, and so they did. And each of them, in turn, had something to say. I think Arthur C. Clarke, from a humanistic point of view, had his story to tell, and Kubrick, from his point of view, had a cinematic story to tell. He wanted to visualize what the future would look like, and to a large degree, he if I say he got it right. Well, we don't have, giant spaceships out heading for Jupiter just yet.
No.
But we did have a space shuttle, and the space shuttle, as depicted in the movie, didn't look too far off what the future space shuttle from that time would look like. And what else did we get right?
Some kind of iPad.
Yeah, I was quite impressed by that. iPads, basically. Yeah. I always thought Next Generation invented iPads.
No, they had flat screen TVs. The guys are sitting at their desk, and on comes the news program, and that's all flat screen. And of course, all the displays around the ship are all flat screen and going away. And it's all very realistic. It's minimalistic and realistic at the same time, because there aren't any random flashing lights that you can't make sense of. Everything seems to have a function.
Absolutely. I think the amount of, again, this is something that probably Star Trek, broadly speaking, kind of is a bit of a suspension of disbelief, is what are all these panels about? But actually, you look at the Discovery here in 2001, every panel seems to have words on it, and you can make out what those words are.
Yeah. Even the toilets. There's a 10 points you had to study if you wanted to use the toilet. And the man standing there sort of, reading all the fine print. So he, understandably doesn't want to get that wrong, but,
I'm pretty sure that there is a real notification on, say, the International Space Station that tells you how to use the toilet.
Yeah.
But however, when you gotta go, you gotta go.
Yeah.
And where no man's gone before.
Dear. Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting. I guess when we're thinking about the kind of visual similarities between these two films, the person that is really at the centre of that, in a way, is Douglas Trumbull, who worked on both of them. And I suppose, we talked a little bit about the similarities between the kind of model work on the films. And I think there's, definitely you can see that in terms of the detail of the models, which is part of what brings out the scale, but also the way they're lit and the kind of they seem to be lit very carefully in both those films compared to a lot of, even just a lot of science fiction films. Yeah. I mean, that endless flyby scene of the Enterprise, it is overlong. I mean, it is slightly laughable to watch. At the same time, it is beautifully shot. It is like, if you're going to spend 5 minutes or whatever it is staring at a model, they've worked out how to do that, both visually and, of course, with Jerry Goldsmith's music and so on. But the other thing, of course, that they both have in common is, particularly at the end with 2001, we've got this kind of, I don't know even how you describe it, this sort of visual, abstract visual stuff on screen that, it may or may not mean... It is like a piece of abstract art in a sense. The kind of meaning that you take from it is partly down to what is almost like a Rorschach test or something. Yeah. And obviously in the motion picture with the interior of the Vija cloud, again, there's that kind of sense of these kind of mysterious sort of swirling shapes, these different geometric shapes as well in both films. Again, almost like kind of abstract art, almost like kind of geometric art or something. And these kind of organic forms that could really be anything, but they kind of attract our attention. They sort of suck you in. And obviously, and Douglas Trumbull as well worked on The Tree of Life, that film more recently, which again has a lot of these kind of weird sort of swirly patterns and things.
He also did, if we're thinking about models and ships in sci-fi, he did Silent Running.
Right. Yeah.
So the Liberty Bell, was it? No, it wasn't the Liberty Bell. What am I talking about? It was the cut this bit out. I should know this.
I can't remember the name of it.
So. It was the Valley Forge.
In the Valley Forge.
The Valley Forge.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fantastic.
But yes, he did.
And I think, in both these films, that kind of slightly more abstract visual material is part of what... I suppose is how we represent the unknown, or how we represent, the kind of, the whole mission of Star Trek being to go out there and find, seek out the unknown, seek out something kind of beyond our understanding. Whereas obviously, if you think about space in terms of like our experience of space and NASA and the kind of these sort of things, it is all quite practical. It is all about making sure this bit joins up with this bit and the thing doesn't explode and we don't lose pressure and we don't, and we do manage to land on exactly the right spot and with the orbit doesn't go wrong. It is all these quite mathematical, practical things. But both these films are also very invested in space as this kind of sublime, I suppose, almost this kind of otherworldly, or at least somewhere that you can encounter the otherworldly. You can encounter this kind of almost spiritual thing that's out there somewhere.
And in a way quite terrifying. I mean, the Vija cloud, the first time I watched it, I don't know how old I was, but I found that terrifying. You watch it vaporize the stuff and we don't know what it is, and it's just coming towards Earth, and that's that. And then of course you get that abstract visual sequence with Spock going into the ship first and then Spock off into it, and that doesn't make it any clearer.
No.
No, it was because it was a very dark film and almost monochromatic, and you couldn't, your brain couldn't decipher what's far away and what's near. What even the you know that part over there is an alien thing. You sort of know why it's an alien thing, or you sort of know what it does. But with V'Ger, you never knew what you were seeing. Even when Spock went to great lengths to say, I'm seeing whole continents, planets, solar systems.
Which again, we seem to see in 2001. We seem to see like planet, not just planets, but kind of land masses and all these sort of things. But again, there's this kind of ambiguity about everything you're seeing. It's kind of it's there and then it's kind of swirled away, or it's obscured.
Well, the end sequence is meant to be Dave Bowman's journey through a star system and journey through. I don't think he's going through the intelligence of what's brought him there. He is traveling faster than light, and he is supposedly witnessing the birth of new stars. He's seeing it happen, the creation of new stars and the destruction of others, and anything that goes in between. And then gradually, he, even though he's in a state of shock, he's gradually coming to accept that whatever beings have created all this, they are welcoming him here. He is the first interstellar traveler from Earth, and they're bringing him here gently. They're showing him all this stuff going on around him, but they're bringing him to a final place. And that's why at the end, he's in something he recognizes, which is this room. But he knows that he's billions of light years from home, with no hope or no way of ever getting back. But he's in a familiar place, and they've deliberately done that.
Well, hence the old man and so on. Hence there is something quite horrific about
that's another. That's
and
another.
Even the room itself. It couldn't. I mean, talking about Stanley Kubrick, it reminded me a little bit of the Overlook Hotel. As much as it's got this kind of white light flooring and so on, it's also got this kind of chintzy. I don't know. There's something quite sinister about all of that somehow. I don't know why.
Yeah. Again, and this comes from the novel rather than from the movie. The aliens know that there are certain parts of Earth that you'll be familiar with, or Earth furniture, architecture you'll be familiar with, and so they've done their best to try and make it that way. They may not be modernistic. They may not be in the year 2001. They may have locked out in the 18th century or something, the Regency period or something, but nevertheless they're making an effort. It somehow fits the movie, but
also it's got the sense of the past and the future are kind of mashed
lots of
together, aren't they? So and obviously he's got the old man on the bed. He's got the kind of baby being.
Well, they're all the same person.
Exactly. But
we're an observer, and then he's an observer.
Yeah,
that's what's going on
of his own life.
We're observing, and then it flips, and then he becomes the observer. And then it flips back again, and we become the observer. And that's where you get this crazed up thing. What the heck is going on here? But he's witnessing his own life, coming to a conclusion. There's no sense of time in it. Because we're sitting here and watching him do these things, we get the impression that all this seems to take place inside 20 minutes, whereas we've no idea how long this takes place. He might be living out his life fully for the next 35 years, and then he's getting memory flashbacks. Oh, I remember the time when there was a machine over there. Oh, I remember the time when I was in that bathroom, and I remember the time when I was in the bathroom and I heard a noise and I looked forward and wondered what it was. And so it keeps flipping backward and forwards. But because our expectations on the movie is always for a story to be linear, that's where we get this massive confusion. But ultimately, if I haven't cut across your point, ultimately he does become this elderly man on the bed, and he lifts his hand and points his finger in a Michelangelo style towards what has for him become God. This is the reference going back to Arthur C. Clarke. This rectangular monolith is now bringing him into a new state of consciousness, a new state of being, a new state of evolution. And that's why the movie finishes with this embryonic child still in its, womb-like structure. And then the scene suddenly switches to Earth because in the book, the child is referenced as the star child. Mm-hmm. But it has gathered so much information and so much knowledge, it doesn't need to go back through that long passage of flashing lights. It can be anywhere at once, instantly, at any time. And the film ends with the child almost pondering as to what to do next. What will it do next? I don't know if you picked up on it, but what was supposed to be obvious at the end of the movie, we haven't even done the story yet, but at the end of the movie, is there's no weaponry orbiting the Earth. He's got rid of that. Right. And then he's thinking, okay, well, I wonder what we can do now.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that is very. I've never. God knows how many times I've watched that film.
Because it opens with weaponry. It opens with you have these apes learning, getting gathering, the burgeoning of the birth of intelligence. That's what I'm trying to say. The birth of intelligence, where he's suddenly realizing that a bone can be a tool, and it can be a weapon, and he uses it as a weapon. That you see this first ape getting killed as the first death, or willful death in the movie. And then they, rather than go through thousands of years of history or whatever, we suddenly get projected into the future, and the Earth is surrounded by these satellites, which at first glance, they're communication satellites, but in reality, they're not. They're atomic weapons waiting to be deployed somewhere over the Earth by the various powers, the Chinese, the Russians.
And this is coming from the novel, is it?
Partly out of the novel, yes, obviously from the novel, but depicted...
Because I didn't.
Because it's, right. I know. Because this is the thing, you can't see this on the first viewing of this movie. It's all about the transition of mankind. It's Arthur C. Clarke is telling his evolutionary tale, saying once we were apes and we learned how to do something, now our intelligence has grown so large that we can put things in space now. We can travel to the moon. We can travel in a space station. And whilst all this is going on, and we're introduced to it later in the movie, there's already a mission going out to Jupiter.
Well, and also, I mean, I guess even without realizing that those things we saw going around the Earth were necessarily weapons, there is visually a connection, because that's what that's I think what the cut is between the bone, which is, as you say, I mean, people talk about it in terms of making tools, but really it's about making weapons, and that's what seems to change that society in a way, is it's kind of violent potential. And then we go up to there, and then of course, if you think of it in terms of technology, I suppose it makes a bit more sense of what the whole sort of HAL storyline adds to the bigger picture, because that was the thing that puzzled me, I suppose, about this film. Was I always, going into it, I knew there were these monoliths. I knew they had this impact on the apes. I knew something big was going to happen towards the end. I also knew there was a kind of homicidal computer, but I had no idea why. And in a way, watching it now, I still feel like they're almost like two separate. Did you feel like quite different? It feels almost like two stories that have been kind of mashed together in a way. And as you said beforehand, Tony, the bit in the middle is more conventional in some ways, although it's still a little bit mysterious as to exactly what's going on, but it feels more like a science fiction film. And then the kind of wrap around it is more kind of metaphysical and spiritual and kind of arty, I suppose.
Well, Stanley Kubrick is telling this story, as I said, from a visual point of view. And because the film's non-linear, there are things happening in sections that your brain wants to join the dots, but in some way they can, but you have to really dig deep to see those dots being joined. Okay, so if you don't mind me giving my explanation, which may sort of be like a spoiler thing. Okay, so we have the apes and this monolith appears. And then we suddenly, in a section, one of the apes appears to be suddenly getting a thought at a time when he never had a thought before. And then he thinks, oh, what do I do with this bony thing? Oh, I know, I'll kill an animal. And because of that, they become stronger. Okay, but the monolith is key. And then there's a sequence where the monolith isn't there anymore. And they're carrying on as if they couldn't even remember when it was there, or even what it was, or why it was there. It's gone. Mm-hmm. Then we move forward to the moon, where the humans are scrambling around like, frightened ants, because they found something on the moon that they can't explain. And there's almost a recreation of the scene where when the apes were touching it, wondering whether they'd be killed if they touched it. The humans are touching it in this kind of, what the heck is this kind of thing? But because they've only dug it up, and it's not really explained in the movie, because the lunar cycle is 28 days, it's just reaching the point where the sun is coming around that crater, and the sun's rays hit the monolith. And the monolith has been waiting for that. It knows that when the sun hits the monolith, it knows it has been dug up. It knows some intelligent outside force has found it. All this time it's been giving off a radiation signal. They have found that radiation signal. They've dug down. They've found this thing. And now it's exposed to the lack of atmosphere. But the sun hits it, and it knows, right, I'm emitting a signal. And that's why later in the movie they say the signal was directed directly at Jupiter. It just so happens, independently, they have a mission going to Jupiter. It has nothing to do with the monolith at all. It's a totally independent thing. These are a group of astronauts who are going out to explore the Jovian moons, and 3 of them are in hibernation, and 2 of them are just working around the clock to keep the ship running, and Hal is monitoring everything. But Hal knows something that they don't know. Hal has been given instructions that the real reason we're going there is to find the source of the signal, or the end point of that signal, and nothing must get in that way. And by a series of conversations with the crew, and by playing chess, and by being a super intelligent computer, Hal has worked out himself that the fly in the ointment are the 2 astronauts and the others who will eventually wake up. And he thinks to himself, they're going to screw up the mission, so I better get rid of them. And he works out a way of doing that.
And is that sort of because he wants to have the encounter with the monolith?
No, he's purely.
Than them? I mean,
he's purely. Because it's just logic. Hal is almost like Spock. It's just pure logic. That's it.
Yeah, but I was just because there's this question. I mean, the guy even asks the TV interviewer or whatever, says, does Hal have feelings? And there's this question in the motion picture: does the ILEA probe, if it has ILEA's memories, can it have ILEA's feelings? And this is kind of going to be the key to, and at the end of the film when Decker sort of merges with Vija. That's the whole idea, is to kind of merge the machine. The machine kind of can be very sophisticated and very elaborate, but it lacks that the human quality in a sense. And I was sort of wondering, what is Hal? What's his kind of goal in this sense? And is it that we saw the birth of man, as it says? Are we going to see the birth of the machine? Intelligence, and this is what's required for Hal to become a transcendental computer in some way, or what's the kind of intention?
I don't think Hal has emotions. I think as Dave Bowman says, he acts like he has emotions. He's programmed to do that, to make us feel better, and I really believe that to be the case, and Hal works along those parameters. But in terms of logically working out, the game of chess is significant. When you're playing chess, and I hate playing chess. Well, I love playing chess and I hate playing chess, but the trick is to be 3 moves ahead of your opponent. And Hal has the entire game ahead of his opponent. But that's a kind of a clue. It's a subtle clue that Hal has already worked out. And now he's factoring in, how am I going to introduce what I'm going to do and at what point? And he builds up a very plausible storyline that a communications unit in the antenna array is going to fail within 72 hours. Best check it out. And they do. And he's building up their sort of trust that, okay, that's weird. Oh, let's put it back. Somebody else's turn, and that's when he makes his move. He strikes, and now a whole series of new events occurs. But how? This is one of the beauties of the movies, the movie story. Hal can't make a mistake, but yet he makes a fundamental mistake. He can't outthink humanity's ability to think. So Dave projects himself back into the ship through the emergency airlock, which Hal has no control of. And then we see Dave with a helmet on, because the implication is Hal will try and kill Dave by ejecting all the air out of the ship. So Dave is still in the vacuum, even though he's contained inside the ship. But he now no longer has any control over Dave, and he realizes it. And we have a few funny lines, but ultimately, Hal's put to sleep.
But there's also this sort of question about the fallibility or not of these human-created machines, and obviously, with Hal, there's this question. Well, that a Hal unit has never gone wrong before, and the guy says, isn't that just I was going to say asking for trouble, whatever it is, that's sort of tempting fate or whatever, and obviously. The whole plot of the motion picture ultimately turns out to be about the Voyager probe, and the Voyager probe has kind of, it's come back with this kind of idea that it has to meet the creator and so on. It's come back with certain kind of faulty thinking in a way. Very much, the other, of course, massive influence in the motion picture was the Changeling, the episode The Changeling, where, you had the Nomad probe that was doing a lot of the same stuff, and it had kind of got and in that episode, basically, Kirk talked it into recognizing these kind of logical errors that have been made, all these errors that have been made. You made an error, you've misidentified me as the creator, you've made an error about this and that and so on. And in the motion picture, it's more, I suppose it's a more hopeful ending, because although McCoy says, boy, is it going to be disappointed, basically, when it finds out what the creator is. It doesn't, the film doesn't end in disappointment. It ends in this kind of transcendental moment. And, with the famous line, the human adventure is just beginning. And in a way, so does 2001. It ends because it ends. I found the scene in the kind of hotel room where he sees the old man and then he's dying in the bed and everything is quite shocking and it's uncomfortable to watch and quite scary in a way, sort of existentially scary. But then the kind of baby creature brings it back to this feeling of hope and optimism. And sure, I know, but it's also some kind of sense of the future. And like you were saying, this idea of the start, I felt watching it without having read the novel or whatever, there was this kind of ambiguity about, yes, it's him, but it's also, it's not just a memory of of the beginning of his life that is now equally come to an end. It seems to be something new. And certainly, and maybe that's the impact of having watched the motion picture last night in preparation for this as well, where it's kind of explicitly something new is happening. It felt like that was a new being. And because we've been primed to think, oh, okay, these monoliths come and they change things and they create something new in a way, in some way. That point of it becoming a new being is again the story trying to suggest to you that mankind evolved from these apes. This new star child has evolved from mankind. It's reached a turning point where it's now reaching for the stars, so it's ready to become something new. And the star child comes back to Earth. I'm going to put a few things right here, get rid of all the weapons. And of course, the poor people down on Earth, they don't know what the heck's going on, but a change is afoot. And eventually they've probably come to realize a whole new era has begun. Something wonderful is about to happen.
It is the other reading, or not even another, but a way of reading 2001 is as various leaps in intelligence. And the monolith appears at key moments within that kind of framework. So we go from ape to space, and within the space narrative we have Hal. So we've created our own intelligence, and then we get to the end where something entirely new turns up. That's certainly, I think, one way of following the film, which is, as you said, Arthur C. Clarke's sort of more humanist message, I think, moving through.
So there's also a number of clues, again, going back through the movie, which Stanley Kubrick likes to drop in. And there are a series of birthdays. Floyd Hayward Floyd calls his daughter to wish her a happy birthday. She wants a bush baby. And then the reverse of this, Frank Poole, his parents called to wish him a happy birthday. And then we have the birth of the star child. It's another birthday. So there's all sorts of little things coming in there.
Yes,
Duncan is looking more confused than before he started.
Hang on, just give me a moment.
It was always going to be a bit of an
And I said to Duncan just at the beginning of the movie, just in a whisper, there's even a little clue in the opening piece of music. Das Sprach or Das Spake Zarathustra by Richard Strauss, which is "And God Spoke" or "In the Beginning." It's telling a musical tale. It's saying, in the beginning, this happened, or God spoke and this happened, And famously, and God is the monolith in essence.
Sure. I was just going to say, and famously in 2001, the music was changed at a late stage, right? I mean, there was a score composed for this film that was then substituted with this classical music. And, the classical music is so much a part of that film and so much a part of, the way those scenes are kind of edited together and so on, it's, and not just classical music, but say the Blue Danube is, a dance, and the way that the visual kind of dance on screen is matched up to the music is so kind of elegant and so kind of poetic in a way. That's kind of a big part of the appeal of the film, I think, in some ways. And obviously, of course, with the motion picture as well, we have, Jerry Goldsmith's music famously, and, whether people love the film or have problems with that film, everyone loves the score to that film. It's one of those films where the score absolutely kind of elevates it and helps it to kind of hit that sort of level of profundity that it's going for, in a sense. And that kind of, one of the things I sort of felt watching the motion picture is that, yes, it does drag a lot. It is very slow, but at the same time, it feels like it's about something. Do you know what I mean? And it's not always 100% clear what it's about, but it's kind of, there's definitely a kind of real serious intent behind that film. And it may or may not always totally land as a kind of experience sitting in the theatre, kind of bang for your buck. But it kind of, there's something happening there. Do you know what I mean? And you are, if you can kind of cope with the pacing, your kind of experience, you can go along with that and you can get a lot out of it potentially. I'm kind of curious, Tony, did you see, maybe we could just talk a bit about the motion picture itself as well. Did you see it in the cinema?
I actually saw it on the day it was released. Yay!
Wow. And what were so you had like a genuine, you see, for me, I think the motion picture was probably the last of the original series films I saw. So, I saw it on DVD, but I mean, for you, that was the first one, right? And you were there at that moment, which is a kind of moment that we can't really recapture in some ways.
I didn't go deliberate. If I said I went deliberately to see it because I'm a super Star Trek fan, I'd really be lying. So I'm really being very honest here. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And when I joined the queue to go in, it was in New York, where it was showing, because I think it opened in New York before it opened in the UK. But anyway, I just happened to be there. And all I remember, first of all, was being scared I wouldn't get in because there was a line went around the corner of fans waiting to get in, and everybody sitting down. And we mentioned this dance around the Enterprise with Kirk staring here, there, and everywhere. Everybody was waiting for that moment. Nobody gave a toss
no one cared
about the storyline.
10 minutes.
Yeah. Danger in space. Yeah. Get the crew together. Yeah. Let's see the Enterprise.
Right.
And then when you first introduced to the Enterprise, it's a speck. No. Let's see it, because they did it beautifully. They did it. I mean, they're deliberately teasing you, and then they're showing you this great spectacle, and rightly so, because we're being introduced to a whole new ship. Nothing like, similar in shape to what we saw on the TV screen, but nothing like it at all. Yeah. And very, very realistic and very real. And can I just give a plug for Project Enterprise, which is something very close to my heart. And I work with Paul Olsen, who is the artist who actually painted the surface of the Enterprise specifically for that movie. Right. And he's working very, very hard to reproduce and create a second Enterprise using the same designer, Richard Taylor, and the same builder, Jim Dow. And hopefully that project will get underway in November this year, and we'll see something concrete or plastic this time next year.
Well, it's interesting talking about plastic. I mean, one of the things that struck me about these kind of models is looking at the motion picture. You notice it right at the beginning, because the motion picture starts with those Klingon ships, right? And I was just thinking, if all you've seen is the original series, back on TV, whatever it is, 10 years previously, and you go into the cinema and see those ships, the first thing that struck me about them is the level of detail, because they're not like flat. I mean, often in Star Trek, we get ships that are kind of fairly flat surfaces, and in later years, they use Aztecing and kind of design elements and lighting and so on to try and give them a bit more texture, but they are generally very flat kind of Federation ships. Whereas a lot of science fiction films, you get these kind of, there's all these, whatever they are, pipes or turrets or these kind of little bitty
Greeblies, they're called.
Right. And if you think of, say, the opening shot of Star Wars, for example, the Star Destroyer in that, you've got, again, those little sort of bits and bobs that make it feel more like a large real object. And it's interesting that that's something that obviously comes into Star Trek with literally in the first few seconds of the motion picture.
Well, there are two brothers. I can't remember the second brother, but Jim Dow, who built the framework of the Enterprise and molded the parts that we ultimately see on the screen. His brother worked with ILM, and they were producing the X-Wings and the Star Destroyers and everything else. And they were the ones that realized that if you stick all these little extra bits on, it gives greater texture to the ship and makes it feel like it's it's a real thing. But having said all that, 1977, 78, for Star Wars and Star Trek, the motion picture, if you look at the ship Discovery on 2001, it had an amazing amount of pipe work and bits stuck on, and my goodness me. And I don't know if you know this, but how long do you think that the ship Discovery was in that movie? We see a beautiful passing shot from nose to engines. How long do you think that was?
Well, half a mile? I've
no,
idea.
It was a model,
Oh, I see. You mean real life? I thought you were asking me to estimate the length of the ship.
I didn't make that.
There was some Kubrick
take
clues
you a while
in there
to
tell you the length of the ship.
Yeah, that's right.
How long was the model? I don't know. A meter.
It was 60 feet long.
Oh my God! Wow.
Compared to the Enterprise in the motion picture, which was 8 feet long.
Right.
That's incredible.
Yeah, 60 feet long, and it took 12 hours to do that one shot we saw where it was passing. Took 12 hours, and about 12 hours per shot of it passing. Then they had to go back and do the matting shot, and then they had to go back and do some other compositing shot and put it all together to make it look like it's just gliding through space. It's majestic, and that was Douglas Trumbull.
It is. Yeah, I mean, it's...
According to Trumbull, there's actually about 200 more hours worth of footage or something absolutely insane that, from this movie. That just didn't
Must have been a nightmare to edit this movie.
Yes.
Well, wouldn't we all like to see that extra footage? Kubrick himself
maybe not 200 hours worth.
No, he wouldn't. He's quite famous.
Right.
And I think his daughter, Kubrick's daughter, I can't remember, is her name Valerie? I'll get told off for getting that wrong. But she is actually the little girl in the phone booth in the sequence. That's actually Stanley Kubrick's daughter. But I think she now holds the reins of the Kubrick estate, and I think she keeps her father's legacy as alive as possible. And of course, if her father didn't want any extra movies to be made, then it's not going to happen. But who knows?
Well, it's interesting talking about Kubrick and his kind of eccentricities and his sort of strong views on various things. I suppose one of the things I thought we might talk a little bit about in relation to these two films, 2001 and the motion picture, is this idea of kind of the role of the director. And Kubrick, I guess, is almost synonymous with these kind of ideas of the director as this kind of artist, as a sort of slightly, I was going to say tortured. I don't know if he was tortured, but not necessarily a kind of. He was a bit of an odd guy, right? He was a kind of eccentric artist.
I think it would be the kindest word.
Yeah. Whereas Robert Wise you know, maybe had a reputation, although his work could kind of veer from genre to genre and so on. I think there was a tendency to see him, one description I read was to see him as an artisan rather than an auteur. Yeah. And I don't know whether that's fair or not, because he made some fantastic films, but I can sort of see the argument there that he's kind of a guy who he'll go in and he'll make the film that needs making and he'll do a decent job on it, but he's not a kind of... an artist in this kind of...
Robert Wise made 3 great science fiction movies and 1 musical, but he's only remembered for the musical.
I know. Well, he made two good musicals, didn't he, at least? West Side Story and Sound of Music.
You got me on that one. Okay.
So there you go. But I mean, but I think there's an element, I mean, I don't know, Chris, what your thoughts are on that, but certainly there are directors, you know, even today, it seems to me, who, someone like Ridley Scott, I would say, like, bangs out a load of really impressive films, jumping genres, doing whatever, but it does feel a bit like he goes in and he takes what it is and gives you the best version of that he can come up with, as opposed to someone who kind of all their films have a sort of it's all about them. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I have various problems with the auteur theory from a sort of kind of practical level, because I think, well, actually it takes hundreds of people to make a film, so the director is only, but in order to kind of apply it, you would say that a director has to have a set of trademarks, something that you can identify through a series of films regardless of genre, you know, because most directors don't work in one genre, they actually work across multiple ones, and from that point of view, I think, you know, when you've seen a Stanley Kubrick film, there is something, you know, something about that and, say, The Shining or Barry Lyndon or Eyes Wide Shut that makes you, I'd say, actually slightly unnerved. That's my...
that's, you know, disturbed, and you can't quite put your finger on it.
Not at all. And they're all so different, right? So, you know, of course, The Shining is going to disturb you in a very different way to Eyes Wide Shut, in a very different way to 2001. These are... But it's because he does that exquisite cinematography, which is obviously a level of his perfectionism, but of course there are cinematographers working with him and collaborating on all of those. Can you say the same about others? You know, I think your Ridley Scott one's a really good example. Yeah, nice, capable director, but can I take 3 Ridley Scott films and say, I know that was directed
in a
by
blind
Ridley
test?
Well, because you've also got weird... remember his weird phase, that film Matchstick Men? And there's another really weird, almost rom-com with Catherine Zeta-Jones. That's him, somewhere in the early 2000s. He
Not Entrapment?
No. I'd love it if that was a rom-com.
I thought
that's such a famously awful film. No, not the rom-com. So, but you can't take Alien, Gladiator, and Matchstick Men and go, well... No. I know that,
and that's not to say that they're not. I mean, like many of them are not like classic fives. I mean, Blade Runner is probably my favourite film. Yeah, and it's not. And I'm not. I don't know what I'm saying, because I'm not. Obviously, there's an enormous amount of artistry in that film.
But Tom Cruise.
I think it's. I suppose what it's really is about. Does the director adapt themselves to the material, or do they adapt the material to themselves?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I would say, because I actually love Ridley Scott, I really admire his work. So it's not actually, I'm not being derogatory to say.
No, and I didn't mean it in a negative way, really.
It's not a negative
and I like a lot of Robert Wise's films. I mean, and they're very different, and they're very, you know, and he's very, I mean, you know, as you said, Tony, you know, from a fantastic kind of Hollywood musical through to, you know, we were talking earlier about the Andromeda Strain, which is something that we talked about on Primitive Culture a few months ago, which is a weird film, but it has a lot of, you know, it's a very effective film in certain ways anyway. Certainly it has its effective moments.
Thinking of this idea of technical detail that we see here in 2001 and that we see in the motion picture, I think the Andromeda Strain's got it in spades as well. I thought, I'm sure you guys could move through this lab quicker.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm sure you could.
But it does build up that sense of dread. And maybe that's partly what you're saying about Kubrick having this kind of idea of like this sort of discomfort and this, you know, there's something slightly awkward about the whole experience. And I don't know whether in the motion picture we get that necessarily. I think the motion picture has a real pacing problem insofar as it does drag, and it does just feel like things are taking too long in terms of the story, especially, as we said, married with this idea that keeps coming up in the plot that everything's super urgent. Yeah. And the problem is there's something about the stakes in that film that I think don't quite work, and it's partly because they're trapped inside the Voyager cloud, that we don't know. All we get is like these reminders saying, "Oh, we're 3 minutes from Earth. We're we're an hour from Earth. Whatever it is." But we never see it because we're sort of trapped inside until the very end. And it does have a weird echo of 2001, I suppose, in that he's trapped in that room. Like you were saying, Tony, we don't know. Is he in the past, the future, 1,000 light years away? He's just trapped in this room. He can't see anything. And in the same way, in the motion picture, they're trapped in the Voyager cloud until the very, very end, where the Enterprise kind of emerges and we're back at Earth. We don't really know where we were. And I think that's another slight problem I have with that film, is that there's not very much boldly going, because they don't really go anywhere. Yeah. They go at like half warp speed for a bit. They finally get to the cloud. They get inside the cloud. It takes them back where they started. And the whole journey of the film, I'm not trying to bash the motion picture. I think it has a lot of interesting stuff going for it. But the whole journey of the film is very much internal and kind of philosophical and kind of, it's Star Trek on that level. It's not really Star Trek on a kind of cinematic level in a weird way. It's this weird sort of mixture of the very internal, and Star Trek does that. I mean, Star Trek can go from, a couple of people in a room arguing essentially for the best part of an episode out to like huge space battles or whatever. But I wonder whether that film, it's sort of weirdly merging those two elements in some ways, in that really the kind of heart of it is very... It's quite a small story in a way. Like both of these films, to be honest, if you just plotted out what happens, it wouldn't necessarily take up that many pages of paper. Do you know what I mean? I was thinking, I don't know what the script for 2001 looks like, but there's so little dialogue. It must be, it's not going to be a kind of hefty tome.
Going back to that, I mean, that the story was a collaboration between Kubrick and Arthur C. Clarke. There wasn't any original material. Kubrick wanted to make a science fiction space movie, and the only reason he wanted to do that was because we were in the height of the space race. Man was going to the moon. It was only a year after 2001 came out that Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. But there was this whole excitement going on about, and fascination with space. So he was just projecting that forward and saying, well, okay, here we are. It's whatever, we're in 1966, 67. What will life be like 30 years from now? And the only person who had any kind of tie into that was Arthur C. Clarke, who was proposing satellites in space to create telecommunication, and the space elevator, the idea that you could have something in geostationary orbit and it would be tied to the ground and you could go up into space on this lift thing, which was used in episodes of Voyager. Which, but same idea.
Yeah, the whole episode's on that lift, isn't it? Some kind of thriller, who's killing who.
Yeah. And so Arthur C. Clarke was the man to talk to.
Sure.
And so they collaborated. And the only knot that was tied that would put the two together was Arthur C. Clarke's story, The Sentinel, which is where this pyramid-like shape is buried on the moon, waiting for someone to uncover it. And when it's uncovered, it sends out a signal heralding the dawn of a new age for mankind, because they've discovered some extraterrestrial intelligent off the Earth. And that was it. There was this little short story that they expanded into the middle of 2001, which is telling a bigger story. I mean,
it's interesting that this idea of sort of what does the monolith represent, I suppose. I mean, you were saying by the end he sort of sees it as a god or whatever it is. Obviously, I guess we sort of assume, or certainly I assume, they're a bit like the, in the Star Trek. So the Paradise Syndrome, for example, you've got the Preservers, this kind of ancient race who've kind of, this idea of these sort of ancient aliens, which crops up now and then, who have kind of had some impact on human beings, whether that's in terms of jiggling around a bit with evolution or whatever. So some kind of supernaturally powerful entity of some kind. And I suppose the monolith itself is kind of an interesting visual for that, because it's blank, it's so unknowable, it's so, we got all the mysterious visuals with the kind of swirly things and the weird kind of lights and the color and all these kind of things that are kind of dazzling. And in both films you have a character who witnesses all of that and is kind of bedazzled by it. Spock is kind of completely floored by it. The character in 2001, you get these same shots of like the mask with the reflection of things and the face kind of almost unable to cope with this sort of like almost like having a kind of epileptic fit or something from the kind of imagery. But you also have this kind of blank black it's a void almost, isn't it? The monolith, and it's so regular and square. It's so alien to our idea of what life is. I suppose that's the thing. It seems like a machine. And of course, with Vija, you have this whole concept of this cloud, which feels quite sort of organic and sort of mysterious and swirly, but it's also got these very mechanical components, and in fact turns out to be a machine kind of intelligence, essentially. And just that idea, I suppose, in both films of like coming up against something that is so beyond our understanding of anything that we have a frame of reference for, and this comes up certainly in the motion picture. There, all these lines saying, it has whatever it is, 12 times the amount of power of something else, or it's kind of like, on every scale. And in order to communicate with it, they have to speed up their transmission massively, so they can get through to it. So on every scale, it's kind of unreachable somehow, alien, but also kind of. I guess what you get in that film is also this sort of idea of transhumanism and kind of going beyond our sort of organic, regular.
There is a very kind of subtle
and so on.
Point between the two movies in the sense that in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, V'ger is seeking its creator. In 2001, the monolith is virtually saying, I am
Here I am.
I'm seeking you. Where have you been all this time? What took you so long?
And in both films, this is in a kind of secular framework. I mean, they're very spiritual, but they're also kind of secular, and they're science fiction with an emphasis on the science and so on. And they're kind of trying to, I suppose, capturing some of that sort of spiritual, almost religious, almost kind of, sort of transcendental feeling, but within a kind of rational framework, even if visually they kind of go off the rails a little bit in terms of the kind of representation of that which is beyond what we can kind of comprehend somehow. It has to be put up on the screen somehow. It might be incomprehensible, it might be beyond our understanding, but it has to be represented visually. So you get these kind of quite abstract visuals.
I think it's also classic Star Trek in the way that it's big ideas, right? It's cerebral, and that, of course, is famously what Star Trek did so well. It almost never made it to TV. Don't make us think, for goodness sake, and don't put a woman on the bridge. But it's that kind. It's doing that just with a massive budget.
Yeah,
and the budget's there, the effects are there, the models are there. But it's still doing what I think the best episodes of Star Trek do, and throwing out some big ideas and making the audience sit there and think. Again, God help the poor audience.
And then there's that weird tension, of course, because then, when you come around to Star Trek 2, it's much more back to the kind of, it's not back to the cage, it's back to the kind of TOS and, slightly more kind of, I don't know, a bit more human, a bit more kind of, a bit less cerebral, I guess.
I think.
And I suppose the elephant in the room, in a way, in terms of talking about the motion picture, is, of course, Star Wars, because between 2001 and the motion picture, the big game changer in terms of science fiction was Star Wars, which in some ways has more in common with the original series than it does with either of those things, insofar as it's quite human, it's quite, there's a kind of comedy, there's a kind of rompy quality to it. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean.
And it's interesting in a way that when they brought Star Trek back for the motion picture, it did seem like they were looking much more to 2001, much more to this kind of grand science fiction of ideas and kind of metaphysics and this kind of meaning, like really sort of serious grown-up science fiction, really, rather than taking the lead from this phenomenally successful
everything in
sci-fi
2001 is plausible, you see.
Yeah.
It's plausible that one day, I mean, we have a space station, albeit not rotating through space the way we see in 2001. But nevertheless, we do have a space station orbiting the Earth. We do have a delivery system up to that space station, which can now automatically dock. It doesn't need a pilot, but it'll go up there and dock within seconds and perfectly well, and release and come back to Earth again. So we do have all that. And it won't be too long, possibly, it won't be very long, realistically, that there will be a ship going out to Mars to carrying humans to see what can be done out there. So this is all from 1968, when they conceived the idea, 2001 was just over 30 years away. That's proven to be a difficulty. The technology has moved on greatly, but the delivery systems haven't. So, but it will happen eventually. So, but everything was plausible. Everything looked plausible, and there wasn't anything. Nobody had any laser guns, phaser guns, lightsabers, anything.
Warp drive, transporters.
Warp drives, yeah, exactly.
I mean, Star Trek has sort of baked into it certain ideas that do push. It's not hard science fiction. That's the thing, isn't it? Star Trek is kind of. It is grounded in a more. It's more towards the end. It's more towards the fiction and less towards the science, if you know what I mean, compared to something like 2001. Yeah. And the motion picture maybe is an unusual step insofar as it does seem, like you were saying earlier, Chris, so invested in the kind of mechanics of these what for them must be very mundane things of taking the worker bee around the ship or kind of, the kind of engineering of the ship and so on. And takes it away a little bit from the kind of heroic action adventure-y stuff that maybe, and you can see that even in the characterization of Kirk. I mean, from this character who was always very kind of confident and kind of, I don't know, quite easygoing, he's become he's put in a slightly awkward situation. We're not quite sure, is he the right man for the job anymore? Has he been behind a desk too long? And it's not even got the kind of pathos in a way that it has in The Wrath of Khan, which kind of borrows that same storyline. There's a real sense of is he actually just, Kirk is a jerk? Is this kind of jerk Kirk coming on board and throwing his weight around? And even by the end of the film, do we entirely trust his motives? Because, Decker has been questioning them, McCoy's sort of been questioning them. There's this sort of weird sense around, what is his, has he almost got a kind of agenda because he wanted his ship back so much? And at the end of the film, he's just like, right, we're going off. Let's go off the other way.
Go,
is this basically a joyride? That what are their orders? What are they meant to be doing?
Well, you said yourself,
they saved Earth. They can do what they like.
You said yourself they didn't go far enough in the film.
That's true.
So
now it's about
now
time.
I've got my command back. Can we actually go somewhere?
So where do they go?
5 this time, please.
They went that way, but which way?
Which way is that? Right. It is interesting. It's quite a bold choice to go for the more cerebral science fiction, when obviously the only reason the motion picture got made is because people saw the success of Star Wars.
Well, that's a true story. Paramount wanted their Star Wars. Fox,
absolutely.
20th Century Fox had Star Wars. They made a killing on it. And Paramount just wanted a jump on the bandwagon type deal. Unfortunately for us, they had Star Trek up their sleeve, which was absolutely magnificent. And of course, the famous story is they were in the process of producing Star Trek Phase 2. And they halted that entire production to throw the budget into the movie.
And I suppose that's, in some ways, that's the answer to why we didn't get a more Star Warsy. I mean, if you think of, say, Star Trek 2009, that to me is Star Trek as Star Wars. Do you know what I mean? I mean, I always thought that film was basically J.J. Abrams' calling card saying, "Can I direct Star Wars?" And it worked out for him. And okay, whatever. But I mean, they could have made a Star Warsy Star Trek film in 1979, but they didn't. And maybe that's the answer as to why they ended up making this very cerebral, very kind of cool film, was the work that had been going into Phase 2 and some of the characters that they've been developing there. And Gene Roddenberry kind of on his most sort of, and we saw it again with Next Gen, with the beginning of Next Gen, this very kind of utopian but a little bit sterile, the early years of Next Gen, before they kind of developed that real kind of camaraderie between the crew. There is that element of, particularly from Picard, and kind of filtering down, that kind of coolness, that kind of aloofness that definitely seemed to be how Roddenberry seemed to want to reimagine Star Trek at that time. And it took other people coming in to kind of bring the life back into it in some ways.
That's absolutely it. I mean, famously, they weren't allowed to write conflict between their characters, right? I mean, they weren't
allowed to grieve people who died. They weren't allowed to.
I mean, this is just ludicrous. I mean, this is why we watch. This is why we watch anything for conflict, and the original series is so famously full of it. There's not one episode where Kirk, Spock, and McCoy aren't in some sort of disagreement and that's so wildly entertaining that no matter how ludicrous the plot, you're there with the characters. And so, I'm very glad Next Gen got put on the right foot. And in the motion picture's a funny one there too, isn't it? Because I'm a massive fan of The Wrath of Khan. It's probably the Star Trek movie that I go back to the most. And Undiscovered Country is my next one, actually. So the two Nicholas Meyer ones are my go-to because the characters are all there. Yeah. And there is this sense in the motion picture that they're not quite there. Like, we do get some nice Spock moments and some nice McCoy moments.
Well, maybe that was part of the point in a way. They'd all moved on, with the exception of Sulu and Chekhov and Uhura. Everyone had moved on. Kirk was now an admiral. Spock was on Vulcan. Yeah, something was pulling them back to the Enterprise. Neither of them. They either knew why, or they certainly with Kirk, he had his own agenda, and he was just looking for an avenue, an excuse.
They all had their own agendas, is the thing. I mean, Kirk had his agenda for getting the Enterprise back. Spock didn't really want to be back in Starfleet particularly. I mean, I know by the end he sort of says, I don't have any business on Vulcan anymore. But, clearly at the beginning of the film, he's doing something else with his life. McCoy's doing something else with his life. It's kind of like getting the gang back together, but they're almost not entirely sure they want to be back together. Well, particularly McCoy is really pissed off about it. He's like, what the hell have you brought me here for? And then he says, basically, I'm terrified. Yes. Those were my last nerves, being shredded, basically. So there's this kind of, it's not like they go straight back to the old relationship and the kind of, we think of like Star Trek 5 and the campfire and everything, that kind of, the warmth of that, even with the bickering.
But that's what I'm saying. Were they not trying to make that point? The point that everybody was...
They didn't really know each other as well as they used to.
They'd separate. It's like when you're best friends with all your mates at college or school or whatever, and you meet up in a bar 20 years later, and you try and recapture that, and you suddenly realize, oh, no, you can't really do it. It was great then, but you can't recreate it. And so maybe there was an element of that that took them a while to gel. And Kirk just wanted to get the job done. Spock is there's something mysterious going on. I have to figure out what this is. It's going to affect, as you say, McCoy doesn't want to be here, but he's there anyway. And of course Scotty was there because he's always tinkering with stuff. And they're just all thrown together again, but thrown together almost as strangers, trying to rediscover each other's weaknesses and strengths. Maybe that's what the movie was meant to be saying, but it wasn't made clear. Because we want to see TOS on the big screen, everyone happy and chummy, and McCoy calling Spock a green-blooded son of a bitch, or whatever.
But at the same time, it's that complicated thing of saying, well, we can't just make a film, even though many of the aspects of the film do cater to existing fans. You can't just make a film and hope it'll do well at the box office because a load of Trekkies will go see it. That's not enough. You've got to, as you're saying quite correctly, probably press the reset button, which is bringing them all back. Who are they? Where have they been? Because you might have had loads of people would have been in the cinema to see that who'd never watched the original series.
And therefore you've got to think, so what is this film to someone who isn't already invested in these characters? And maybe in that instance it is a kind of grand metaphysical sort of philosophical exploration of the future of transhuman beings. It is a kind of a meditative film in the sense that 2001 is this kind of, an art film in a sense. It's kind of almost reaching for that. Obviously, by the time you get to something like Star Trek 4, it's like, okay, it's a rom-com. That again was a way, and famously the most popular of the Star Trek films because it did completely bridge that gap.
Absolutely.
Once you get to Star Trek 6, it's a kind of Cold War thriller. It's that is one of the great elements of Star Trek, I think, is its flexibility. It's kind of generic flexibility. And the original series films, they did, do a pretty good job of exploring the different things that Star Trek could be.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
Well, before we go, do you guys have any final thoughts on 2001 or the motion picture or anything that we kind of haven't covered that you wanted to bring out about the connections between these two films?
Only that it was wonderful to see the Enterprise leaving space dock, and in 2001, the Discovery gliding past eyes, and knowing that Doug Trumbull worked on both movies and in various ways made both movies a cinematic success. And I love seeing both those pieces of work every time.
And I think it's nice to see Gary Lockwood.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Famously from Star Trek's second pilot.
From the second pilot, the less cerebral one. He's ramping up his cerebral qualifications.
Possibly, but I still love Where No Man's Gone Before, and think it's still really good sci-fi actually. So I don't, but yes, less cerebral, but nice to see Gary Lockwood again. Connection.
And you were saying, Tony, that there's also in the motion picture almost kind of little Easter egg for fans of 2001 that the Klingon ship is named after one of the characters in this film. Is that right?
Well, you'd wonder, really. Martin Amar is named as the newsreader in 2001. He comes on and he's the man who's talking to the crew and to Hal. And the name Amar appears in Star Trek as well. At the beginning, it's one of the Klingon ships, I believe, that gets destroyed by the Vija cloud.
Interesting.
It's just that name, Amar.
It's a subtle, a very subtle little Easter egg for anyone who's really paying attention to both these films. But I mean, I think you don't need to be clued into that level of detail to see the similarities between these films and to see where the motion picture is getting some of its kind of distinctiveness from. It's certainly not getting those qualities from the original series. It's, if anything, it probably is picking up from 2001. And obviously, 2001, although I think it had some quite mixed reviews to begin with, it presumably, fairly quickly started building this kind of following and this kind of its status, it being recognized as a kind of important work of art, really, as the idea that science fiction could be art, I suppose, which maybe before then was questionable.
Yeah, you had your 50s and 60s science fiction was sort of relegated to B movies, really. There was some interesting stuff around stuff like Quatermass, and that was maybe again a bit more cerebral, if that's our theme. But I think 2001 was the thing that put it on the map as something that can be kind of properly respected as a cinematic work. The audiences and critics alike are going to go, all right, this is something to be contended with. And as I think I've said once already on this, I think that took a while to set in. 68, it was there. But really, our big sci-fi blockbusters, as we've come to know and love them, hit around the late 70s. And so I just think
from Star Wars onwards.
From Star Wars onwards, because as soon as Star Wars made money, again, I think it's also ruined several filmmakers' aspirations, to be honest. But as soon as Star Wars made money, everyone realised that they should be putting money into science fiction, and that changed.
Oh, I know. When Star Wars came out, I saw it probably as often as I saw 2001. But I remember going to see Battlestar Galactica, the first movie, and thinking, I don't really like this. It's jumping on the bandwagon. And for the sake of having a spaceship in space and a fight somewhere with some things flying around.
They were successfully sued by 20th Century Fox for something like 12 points of copyright infringement.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's good we never saw the Star Wars, Star Trek back in the late 1970s. Maybe actually it worked out for the best.
Yeah.
Well, it's been fun talking about these two films today, and fun for me to be able to see 2001 for the first time. Before we go, why don't you guys tell our listeners where they can find you online, or if they want to carry on the conversation one way or another? Tony, you go first.
Well, on Twitter, you can get me at Shamrock165. You'll find me on the Babel Conference on Facebook. And please listen to Continuing Mission, which is the podcast that I speak on. You can hear my voice. And also, don't forget Melodic Treks with Brandon Shea Matella, where we talk about the music of Trek and beyond.
Cool. I'm at the University of Greenwich, lecturer in film and television production. And you can find me on Twitter with the handle @Nunn. That's Nunn, nonetheless.
Well, thank you, both of you, for joining me once again. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Talking about Star Trek the Motion Picture and 2001 A Space Odyssey is not the only thing we've been doing on Trek FM this week. So have a listen to what else you might have missed out on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, Primitive Culture, a look at history and culture through Star Trek.
I remember the freedom of having my own car, and believe it or not, I actually had a Plymouth Fury. It wasn't a 58, right?
No way.
It was a 73, but yeah, my first car was a Plymouth Fury, and the movie was part of the reason why. When I saw that for sale, it was a cheap car. I paid like $500, $300, something like that for it. It was in really
Brandon,
good shape.
you really didn't take the message of this movie. You went out and bought one of those cars.
It was yellow. It wasn't red, so.
Who knows? Someone might have sprayed it.
Standard Orbit.
We recorded most of the Shatner episodes. Every now and then we missed, like, okay, we'll get it next round with Nimoy. We kind of thought it'd be the same thing. It's like, oh, there's going to be no difference. It's just Spock reading it instead of Kirk. No, completely different, right? So it's like, oh, crap. We should have bought 160 tapes instead of 80 for this.
Literary Treks.
I did like the scenes with his family and Riker, spending the night at the home, getting up in the morning, having breakfast with the family. Oh, look, they made him coffee. There was just something really nice and settling about Riker just being in that situation and being treated with such respect and with arms around him, just welcoming him and making him feel at home. And I guess you don't really feel that all that often in many Star Trek stories when you beam down to a planet and you're just welcomed into somebody's home and you're just seeing what a normal, happy family is like.
Warp 5.
That's kind of how Trip acted, though, right? He needed to see this. He needed to actually step in to the situation, and I appreciate that. Like a lot of people give him some flack for being kind of pig-headed, or I think they even almost assume that he has a problem with the three genders, and he's like, no, I don't have a problem with the three genders. I have a problem that this third sex. I guess they get it wrong. Enterprise, the writers should have said sex the entire time. They should have said sex, but I'm guessing, they're on TV, and if they say sex a whole bunch, they might get the wrong idea.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out all these shows and join the conversation about your favourite corner of the Star Trek universe and beyond. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on iPhone, iPad, or Apple TV, or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they are published.
And please leave us a star rating and a written review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, in most third-party apps, and you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, and there are many ways for you to do that. The best place is to join the larger conversation on the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type in Babel, B-A-B-E-L, into the search field on Facebook, and it should come right up.
If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Choose to send to a show and select Primitive Culture. That'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM.
Primitive Culture is brought to you by Duncan Barrett and Clara Cook. You can find Duncan Barrett on Twitter at Barrett's Books. You can find Clara on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC.
If you'd like to help us keep all our shows coming to you each week, you can become a patron of the network on Patreon. Visit patreon.com/TrekFM. That's patreon.com/TrekFM to get all the details.
Perks include early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more, available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month. We really appreciate any support you can give us, and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/TrekFM.
We'd like to take this opportunity to thank our associate producers here at Primitive Culture, Tony Black and Amy Nelson. Tony was one of the founders of this show, and we still keep him in the loop about what we're doing. You can find him on Twitter at @AJBlackWriter, and online hosting about a dozen other podcasts on everything from The X-Files to classic cinema. Amy is the host of 2 shows on the Trek FM network, Earl Grey and The Edge, and you can find her online on Twitter at Miss Amy Nelson.
You're blended all right.